The premise of a final offer can be quite sharply different. One is we'll put forward a proposal that we think there is a real chance they will accept, and we'll put forward a proposal which we think they ought to accept in their own interests and the peace of the world, but what we really want is to be clear that we had a reasonable position when we pulled the trigger. We don't much expect them, and we're not prepared to negotiate about it. If what the Iranians wanted was a civil nuclear program, they could have had it years ago and we'd probably be paying for it. They might be induced to want to settle for just a civil nuclear program. And what do you think are the incentives that the Iranians will have? Partly on the downside, they will lose the war. It may be a grim war, but in the long run, if we want to, they'll lose it. Or are there incentives which are not arguing about how many centrifuges can dance on the head of a pin that will induce them to take what it's hard to believe is what they really want?
The final offer would give Iran everything it said it's won. So we're not asking them to give up what they've announced as their goal. And that's a useful thing, both with the Iranian public and with the world public. We have to face the distinct possibility that our campaign of greater pressure on Iran will not influence the Supreme Leader. I mean, the Supreme Leader has good reason to believe that North Korea is a success and China is a failure, because North Korea has sustained its revolutionary fervor through several generations of leadership, whereas the Chinese regime, while it's still in place, has lost its revolutionary fervor. Now, if that's the criteria by which he judges what constitutes success, the fact that North Koreans are starving and the Chinese are prosperous is not as important. And if that's the situation we face, we should find that out soon. Because in that situation, we are headed towards war. And we need to clarify that. I'm not sure that the Iranian leadership would agree with that judgment. I'm not even sure the Supreme Leader would make that judgment. But it is quite possible that he will. And if he does, we should know that soon. I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall we had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war.
Gentlemen, let me ask. I wanted to ask a question about a word that hasn't come up in unusually in a discussion of dealing with Iranian nuclear problem. That hasn't come up at all, and that is sanctions. If you ask most, I think the standard talking point is sanctions are beginning to work, but they need more time. The equation of that side of the equation hasn't come up in today's discussion. Could one interpret this discussion as being sanctions have done what they're going to do, and the main focus of effort now needs to be on sharpening the negotiations and getting to an endgame offer and clarity on that? Or is there still room in the picture for increasing the amount of pressure on the Iranians, either through sanctions or other means, as a way to enhance the prospects for the diplomacy we're talking about?
Look, the sanctions are starting to bite on Iran's economy. And we are going to learn before too long how much priority the Supreme Leader places on that. And it is distinctly possible that he would be prepared to see Iran become North Korea. That may be a desirable model for him. I don't think it's a desirable model for the Iranian people at all. I don't think that's what they want. And I think he'd face a lot of resistance if he tried to push that idea through. But that is possible. I mean, this is a man who seems to place such high priority on revolutionary fervor. And we will find that out. I don't know. But I would just like to suggest that one can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.